From the southeastern corner of western North Carolina, this is Folklore. I'm your host, James Hernishin. A few months back, an environment reporter for the online news outlet Vox left his office in Brooklyn to pay a visit to Polk County as part of his research for a story about endangered species hit hard last year by Tropical Storm Helene. Instead, what Benji Jones ended up writing about was the damage done to wildlife habitat by the cleanup and restoration efforts. This is what environment reporters do. After everyone else has finished counting the 185,000 destroyed homes and $60 billion in economic damage, they look at the effects on the non-human element. It turns out that driving all that heavy machinery up and down the middle of the Green River and ripping out all those fallen trees may have made things worse, not better, at least in some places and in some circumstances. There's a link to the Vox story in the show notes. You should read it when you have the chance. In hindsight, of course, this kind of thing was all too predictable. Salamanders and mussels occupy very specific ecological niches and can't take any extended vacations while backhoes and dump trucks run rampant over their homes. You can ask humans to relocate in the aftermath of a natural disaster if you have enough emergency financial assistance available and don't play political favorites with those budgets. Other species aren't so adaptable. It's been almost a year since the storm, and so far hardly anyone is talking about the ecological consequences of haphazard cleanup programs. In fact, Larry McDermott is maybe the only other local observer to come across the Vox story. He wrote his own take in the Daily Bulletin a few weeks ago. Kudos to him. We don't get a do-over, so there's very little point in arguing about who's to blame for this oversight. But every climatologist you'll ever meet, and I've talked with a lot of them over the years, will tell you that we need to prepare for more extreme weather events. So it's probably a good idea if we started thinking about how not to repeat any mistakes we've made. I asked Hans Lohmeyer, the stewardship coordinator with Conserving Carolina, who is one of the sources for the Vox story, to share more of his thoughts on what we did right and wrong in the weeks and months after Helene. We talked at Harmon Field a few days ago. Hans Lohmeyer, welcome to Folklore.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Before we get into talking about this almost a year ago storm that we had to deal with, introduce yourself. And how did you come to be working for Conserving Carolina, and what do you do with them?
Yeah, so I am the Conservation Stewardship Manager for Conserving Carolina. I started the position actually just last month, but I was working with conservation easements before that in a coordinator role, and that's been for 3 years now. So I started in my academics working in freshwater ecology, attended UNC Asheville for undergraduate, and then got my master's degree at Appalachian State working with freshwater ecology as well in biology, specifically with freshwater mussels. So after completing grad school, living in Boone, my wife had moved to Asheville and we had experience there through undergrad, and that's where we met. So I secured a job with the State North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, working in a propagation lab for freshwater mussels, so recreating their life cycles. So I was able to move back to Asheville. From there, I left my state position and eventually secured a job with Conserving Carolina, based out of Hendersonville.
And so what do you do for those guys?
It's kind of a broad title. So specifically what I do is I help manage our conservation easement lands. And typically that is privately owned, so they have a private landowner. And a lot of it is interaction and engaging with that landowner to make sure that they are following their conservation easement document. And ultimately what that means is these landowners can set up a conservation easement, which is a legal agreement between us and them, that they are signing away some of their developmental rights of their property in perpetuity in order to promote either sustainable development or no development and allowing the land to stay the way that it is forever.
Right. So the owners continue to be the owners of the land. They just can't really do anything that violates the terms of the easement.
Exactly. And typically during the process of land protection and setting up these easements, it's a negotiation. So landowners have the opportunity to plan for the future.
Yeah. So let's just start off with Tropical Storm Helene. What was your first reaction? Because as a freshwater biologist, is that the prism you see this kind of thing through?
Yes, definitely. So my first experience with the storm, and specifically with a landowner in a conservation easement, was on the Green River just below Lake Adger. So a big part of my job is I have to conduct an annual visit of each one of these easements to make sure that the language is being followed every year. So this just happened to be the first one along the river post Helene. And what I saw was absolute devastation. Trees completely along this riparian area that were leaning all crumbled together, along with cabin walls, drum barrels, mattresses, just a lot of things that you would never expect to see in the wild that had just been deposited due to the dramatic effects and flooding of Helene.
I think a lot of people will recognize that description from the Green River here in Polk County. And you have surveyed the damage in Polk County as well?
Yes, not to the entirety of it, but I manage over 150 easements, a lot of them being along the Green River in Polk County. So typically my experience has been going into those easements, seeing those properties and how they experience the storm. And a lot of them are riverside.
Now, most of the attention that's been paid to the aftermath of the storm has been the economy of the region, the home people, like I think it was some 30 some homes along the Green River that were wiped out. But I'm here talking to you about the ecological damage. And I got to admit, I don't think it's gotten nearly the amount of attention that it probably should have. You can understand people are going to want to first thinking about their homes and about money and about the economy. But you can't build an economy around a natural resource if that natural resource is imperiled.
Yeah, that is a great point, and I completely agree with you. Ultimately, especially right after the storm, say early January, February, there was a ton of pressure to a return to normalcy after the storm. Seeing, say, cabin walls and pieces of houses thrown across your property and along your riverside created a panic, and rightfully so. Everything had completely changed in a matter of 2 days after Helene. And what this in-stream debris removal program was meant to do was to clean that up. And I think they effectively and efficiently were able to do that. But at the same time, it lacked any form of balance that was needed to caretake for the environmental sensitivities along these river stretches as well. It was typically done with a heavy hand, with a lot of live trees and a lot of trees that have been sitting there for decades to over 100 years that have been providing vital habitat for aquatic wildlife. Has been a part of that system for a really long time and absolutely was not providing any hazard or could provide any detriment to public infrastructure or human health or hazard. So that is a case in which that balance just was not achieved. It was really a complete reset in all senses. So this first site that I was describing on the Green River with the cabin walls sitting in the trees, I was able to see it before and after the debris program as it worked through. And as far as sites go, it wasn't a relatively large amount of riparian buffer, but ultimately it went from a hornet's nest of just wood all tangled up with inorganic debris to a completely open space with almost nothing left there. And my point is we seem to have went from one extreme to the other, not taking into consideration what effect that's going to have to the natural environment and how it's going to grow after this major disturbance on top of major disturbance. Ultimately, it's providing a canvas for issues such as invasive plant colonization and just kind of rolling the dice of how these disturbed areas are going to recover.
Am I right when I say heavy machinery driving down the middle of the river, which is
what I saw on the Green River during the height of the cleanup, these huge trucks. I mean, they had a lot of clearance, but they were clearly not going out of their way to avoid doing further damage to the river. Was that avoidable? Because I don't know. My guess is, how else do you go about navigating around that area?
In a way, I think it was unavoidable. Ultimately, they had to get into these areas, but I believe it could have been much more strategic. The entirety of the Green River did not need to be worked through. There are, of course, sections of the river that were less impacted by the storm versus others that needed that complete reset, that complete removal of debris and opening up for allowing for regrowth. And that's still in that same idea of balance. Unfortunately, the entirety of the Green River experienced the in-stream debris program. So the entirety of it received that reset level of clearing. I believe if there had been proper planning, they could have strategically chosen areas where large woody debris had collected. And typically that's around pinch points, such as bridges and narrower sections of the river that likely would have caused future damage if not cleaned out. I hate speaking in absolutes, in which you would think that one storm had impacted an entire river all the exact same, needing the exact heavy-handedness of clearing throughout the entirety of it. Ultimately, there are going to be areas that didn't need that, and those areas were not spared. They received the same amount of heavy debris removal that the areas that actually needed it, and the priority ones that could have caused future risk.
And one of the criticisms that other folks there's some state biologists, for instance, who have weighed in on this, are saying the part of the problem is that the folks who were hired to do the debris removal are basically have an incentive to remove as much as they possibly can, because they get paid by the volume of material. So there's no one to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be paying you strictly on how much work you do, because that means you're going to cause more damage.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. And by county, it was very different. So each county was able to negotiate kind of what their pay incentive was going to be. The most detrimental examples that I had seen were counties that incentivized paying by the tonnage and by the weight, how much they were actually pulling out. And a big reason why that's so detrimental for aquatic wildlife that I touched on a little bit was those legacy piece of woods, the large trees that have been sitting there for decades already, that have essentially become an actual part of the stream, providing so many ecological services and habitat for wildlife. Those are also the ones, if you pull them out and throw them on a truck, they're going to be the heaviest and weigh the most and be worth the most amount of money. So I also experienced counties that incentivize linear foot as well. So paying by the distance, how much distance they were actively working through. Not nearly as heavy-handed, because they're not getting paid to just pull as much as possible by weight. But at the same time, my example with the Green River is an entire river system doesn't need to be worked through. Their incentive is to make it as far as possible with this heavy equipment upstream or downstream. So it's by distance. So there are still going to be areas that don't really need that level of reset and that level of debris collection that are still being worked through because they're getting paid to work through there.
So how did Polk County do it?
I don't know specifically. So I know Polk County was, the complexity of is there was a main contractor, subcontractors, and subcontractors in between. Polk County took the recommendation of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which was typically contracted through Ashbrit. That was the main company. And most of the contracts that I saw with Ashbrit were by weight. But I do not know specifically if Polk County was by weight or by linear distance, but it is likely weight.
I'm trying to be kind of fair to both sides of this argument here. It's not like we've gone through this before. Helene was an unprecedented, at least in human lifespan, experience, and the sheer magnitude of the task was such that, well, let's just get started, and because we got to get started as soon as possible, and working out the details, thinking about the difference in distance and volume, and which species should be worried about. We never got to that level of detail, right?
No.
And so, what I'm asking you is, how realistic is it for us to have considered the ecological dimensions and the implications of the contracting terms. How realistic was that, given that we'd never done this before?
I think as quickly that it was implemented, and I completely agree with what you're saying, as quickly as it implemented, it was very difficult to do that. Ultimately, where we are now, the reason why I'm here talking about this, because I want to improve this program for the future, and I think it can be improved. Ultimately, they got the job done. Their goal was to remove hazardous debris and help protect public infrastructure. They achieved that. Whether my opinion of it being heavy-handedness and causing some ecological destruction is definitely an afterthought at this point. And it is due to the pressure of that returning to normalcy. It's a new program even being implemented with the in-stream debris. So they're working out the kinks, but at the same time, that's not a reason for me to not voice the negative sides of it, because we're not going to learn from this. We're not going to be able to improve the program unless we actually hear the good and bad. Nothing's perfect. I think we live in a time in which it's hard to say that you've made a mistake or there was a mistake made, because there's lots more implications down the line for it. But my goal has always been to want to improve this program, because I truly believe that it can achieve the goal of removing this hazardous debris and also taking into consideration the sensitivities of the environment and the need to protect it at the same time through the process. And my second experience after the Green River actually was in Transylvania County, which Conserving Carolina operates out of. And it was on a section of Little River that I had snorkeled for many years with my state position with the Wildlife Resources Commission, working with 2 species of federally listed mussels. So I was made aware of it in April after they had completed the work along this river. It was essentially wide enough to fit one piece of heavy machinery with tracks down the entire middle of it. And what we found after conducting surveys is that a large amount of these populations were extremely affected and impacted by this heavy machinery tread actively running them over and crushing them. We found live individuals that were alive, but crushed completely, somehow still hanging on. Individuals with very recent tissue that had been crushed, kind of pointing to the timeline of when the work was actually being done. So the question for me in my background of mussels was there any environmental review whatsoever conducted before this work was started? If federally listed species under the Endangered Species Act are not being considered, is there any environmental review being conducted at all? So that made me, moving around counties, that made me a really high alert to considering if there were any environmental reviews, or they were just throwing in heavy machinery and making sure to get the job done. And that was their number one priority. And I did hear from a contracted biologist who I spoke to on the Little River, who said because it was an emergency ordinance, they technically didn't need to take any environmental review under consideration. And her argument was even that the freshwater mussels weren't even there to begin with, and they had been blown out by the storm. We later went back and conducted a survey and confirmed there's still live individuals, there's crushed individuals, and there were a lot of mortalities due to the storm as well. So again, not an absolute absent or present. It had an impact. They're still alive and hanging on, but they were severely negatively affected by heavy machinery running right through the middle of it.
What about the hellbender? I got to ask about the hellbender.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a token endangered species that is found not too many places other than Western North Carolina. Was its habitat severely impacted?
Unfortunately, yes, in a lot of areas. So within this section of Little River with the freshwater mussels, there are also hellbenders within that same reach. And a lot of the negative impact that the debris program had was the heavy machinery tread would run over their typical habitat, which is usually the largest, flattest boulder that you can find. They like to excavate little dens under them. The weight of the tread actively was breaking up these rocks and causing them to shift and likely crushing them as they were working through them.
When you think about the need to coordinate all these different levels of government in this, is there a group that you thought did a better job I mean, we got the state, the federal, and the county levels all involved. And FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency is the federal entity involved here. Did they, in your opinion, do anything better or worse than, say, the state? Because they were taking the lead on this through the Army Corps of Engineers, right?
Yeah, so FEMA was really just the funder, so didn't have much say, I think, in the planning process. The Army Corps, I think, was directly below them with a lot more of the planning duties. Ultimately, I think the trickiness with the level of the Army Corps of Engineers is this was a multi-county project across all of Western North Carolina with contractors below them and then contractors all the way through. And ultimately, they were forced to have the job of providing proper training for all of these contractors and the oversight of them at the same time as the work was being done. And there were so many areas that were having the work done at the same time. There were some that slipped through the crack, and some of the contractors who I believe were working only for profit and not for the benefit of our rivers or for Western North Carolina. And they were able to capitalize on the destruction that we experienced from Helene in order to make a profit. And a lot of times, I think those contractors were coming from out of state to begin with, either Florida or California, Arizona, different states in which they also lacked a local perspective at the same time. One of my biggest issues with the program is that not until much later on did they actually consider reaching out to the State Wildlife Resources Commission for information about areas that they might need to avoid as far as critical habitat or actual individual endangered species. So out of state contractors conducting work in an area they have no clue about, also having to make decisions on the fly of, so is that a hazard tree, or is what's actually causing or what's going to create harm in the future? There's just a lot of what ifs that was, I think, placed on these contractors. And unfortunately, and it makes sense why they would choose this, but they went with the more extreme version, more heavy-handedness. It wasn't as subtle. They wanted to make sure that people knew that they were getting the work done, but at the same time causing more detriment to the environment.
So getting back to this notion that we can point fingers of blame if we want now, but that's not going to undo the damage. So we want to set up, we want to be prepared for a repeat. If, nobody wants to see another storm come through here like that, but if it does, what can we do to prepare so that we aren't left in exactly the same situation next time where speed and volume basically drive the whole process? What kind of mechanisms, what kind of authorities and lines of communication do we need to set up now?
Yeah, as I truly believe that extreme weather events are becoming more common and will become even more so in the future, and I've thought about this a lot, just some simple things that could be implemented into the program right away to help improve it. One of it is allowing that local perspective, allowing our state conservation organizations and wildlife organizations to provide perspective of the actual local community and the local endangered species of our river systems. So ultimately allowing them to have a seat at the table for the initial planning stage when it actually kicks off. And a big part of that is just having maps. They have access to all of the data of where species are, where the critical habitat is, and they can all throw it on a GIS map and have it right away to provide to whoever's doing the planning, whoever's making decision making, and just having that considered at the get-go is going to cause.
Anyway, it's not going to be that difficult because we have the data. We don't have to go and look for it.
It's going to create a more informed decision making earlier on, and so it's not an afterthought that's happening 5 months while they've already worked through a lot of the rivers in Western North Carolina. So it's not an afterthought. It's going to be at the beginning of the planning stage, and it's ultimately going to look like we have the data. We can place it on maps for you. Use this data to inform your decision making of where the work's being done.
Now, other than the two of us sitting on a picnic table talking about this, is anybody in authority talking about this?
Conserving Carolina, along with other conservation groups in Western North Carolina, actually was able to meet with Congressman Edwards to talk about the negative sides of the in-stream debris removal program. And we also had a collection of constituents, a lot of them from Polk County, actually within that meeting. And he was very open to our criticisms. Ultimately, I think right after our meeting, met with the Army Corps of Engineers to discuss the process, and was looking into changing the methodology, actually allowing landowners to flag trees in order to save them from the debris removal program. Now, whether or not that's been implemented, I don't entirely know. I haven't heard much of that being effective. I know biologists for the Wildlife Resource Commission have been spray painting legacy wood, the ones that have been sitting there for a long period of time that are providing habitat, in order to attempt to have them saved and not collected, sometimes being successful and other times not. Alluding to a variance based on which contractor you're working with and what they decide during that exact moment.
Now, one of the positive developments that came out over the last year, because Polk County had these two huge natural disasters, first the storm and then the fires. While the fires were raging, we had these amazing public meetings that the county organized, and I thought it was a really mature way to approach communications, especially when communications technologically was very difficult. We had these public meetings, we had public officials, we had state officials come in and tell us what we're doing and what we shouldn't be doing. And it sounds to me like we need another kind of public meeting where we get everybody who has any interest in this to be aware of what they need to be prepared to do. How do we go about setting that up? And whom should we be pressing maybe at the county level or the state level to take the lead on that?
Yeah, I think that would be extremely effective. And I'm speaking generally here. I think a lot of landowners had the experience of not knowing that this heavy machinery was coming. And then one day it was there along their property line, along their river, maybe even kind of within their property, just hoping that they were going to do the right thing and move on and continue on. And they're providing this service of helping remove hazards to infrastructure and human health. So being able to create a community-led meeting also with politicians include, I think would be a very effective way to at least provide that preliminary planning that would be essential to including the values of that community, which I'm hoping the value would include preservation of natural beauty and wilderness at the same time. So I think it would be most effective to start with a county level. There is typically an emergency services manager who has played a big role for the county, for most of the counties, and they would be a good one to start with. But honestly, as many political figures as you can have in the room with the community, the more effective it's going to be.
But has there been any demonstrated leadership? We got our U.S. senator, we've got our U.S. congressman, and our state reps and senators. Have any of them, as far as taken a proactive approach to this?
Not that I know. The only thing that I've been directly seen and been involved with was the meeting with Congressman Edwards. Nothing specific to Polk County. I am aware of, there was a large effort in Macon County, which is very west and almost not really affected by the storm, where they were also experiencing the in-stream debris removal program, and they rallied with their county commissioners to advocate for this program to end early, because they didn't think it was necessary to be there, and it was causing more environmental damage than needed to be. So I think county commissioners would also be an effective way, with the support of them. A lot more doors open, but ultimately you're still fighting the idea of no one wants to take the risk, and maybe it's not even risk, but no one wants to speak out against the Army Corps of Engineers.
Well, I think people were very happy to see something happening. They were happy to see government response, because too often we hear about government not responding. And the Army Corps of Engineers has a long history of being kind of problematic when it comes to weighing ecological preservation versus infrastructure. So you're right. People were happy to see the Army Corps of Engineers contractors, no matter what they were doing, they were just happy to
Yeah.
see them.
And it was a free program, and you don't pay for it. And the Army Corps of Engineers still has a great reputation of helping with these environmental projects. They're usually the ones who are conducting it. So if the federal government is to respond to a traumatic storm as this, you would expect the Army Corps to do it, and you would expect them initially, or you would expect them to do it correctly. And I think their intentions were always to do that. But as we've spoken about it being a new program and all of the complexities of contractors and the layers of it, again, my goal is only to help improve the system overall. As extreme weather events continue to become more common, this system and this program will be used more and more. And ultimately, I just want to see it more balanced, to help consider environmental preservation at the same time.
One other subject, which I think I'd be remiss if I didn't get into, because you're an aquatic biologist, and a lot of folks here, when it comes to that issue with the Green River, we're talking about fishing. It used to be you couldn't paddle down the Green River, the lower Green anyway, without running into somebody fishing most of the year. What is the fish habitat situation with the Green River now?
It definitely experienced a major disturbance and impact for the negative immediately post in-stream debris removal program. But at the same time, I still consider, nature is extremely resilient, and I think it will bounce back. Ultimately, one of the most detrimental things to fish habitat is the complete removal of woody debris. Fish require and need that woody debris to thrive and essentially survive. And due to somewhat of a heavy-handedness in areas along the Green River and the complete removal of that woody debris, there is not a lot of structure for them to hide. Well, there's a lot less flow refuge for them, so they're constantly fighting the current a lot more. Without that woody debris providing them some sanctuary habitat, as well as the woody debris promotes the growth of insects, aquatic insects they usually use as a food source. Because those have been stripped out and removed, there are definitely will be future negative impacts due to its complete removal.
I'm just wondering if you have any numbers or any sense of any qualifications about whether it's worth your while trying to catch some trout.
Yeah, I believe it's still, they're not gone completely. And again, there will be a transition period. More woody debris will enter the system over time. Trees will always fall down. But ultimately that legacy wood that had been in there and had become part of the habitat and provided that stable benefit, it'll ultimately result in a lower population of trout. So it might become harder to actually catch the trout within areas where it in the past were quite a bit easier.
Now, I have a degree in biology too, but I don't have a lot of experience with this sort of thing. But one thing that I have learned over the years is that nature is relatively resilient in a sense. It's usually more resilient than you think. My personal experience has been with forest fires and clear cuts, and it looks horrible the first year after a fire or someone does a relatively large clear cut. But within 10, 20 years, nature comes back. Can nature come back on a river that's been resculpted the way the Green was? How fast does it take to rebuild the ecological networks that were there before?
I think that's an extremely complex question, at least for timeline wise. It's going to take a long time, I think, for the actual river to reset in itself, just because it was such a dramatic impact. But you're 100% correct in saying that resiliency will kick in. Nature will return to some form of normalcy. I think a big issue with this is when there is clear cutting, typically that regrowth is always going to be slightly less healthy and slightly provide I'll say it again. will provide less ecological services than its predecessor that was before. Because ultimately, what makes these areas so special is the time in which they've been stable. They've been wild for a long time. Once they experience that initial disturbance, it's forever changed, and it's going to take decades to likely build up that stability again. And a big issue with this whole topic is the speed in which these heavy equipment operators came through and cleared it out is ultimately going to result in decades of need of resilience and regrowth of nature in order to return to as close to a resemblance of what it was before, but it's always going to be slightly less.
So in other words, the natural disturbance probably set back or introduced a generation or two of dramatically different ecosystems, and then the cleanup work might have added another few decades or generations on top of that.
Yes, I believe so. And especially as I spoke, with a whole entire river being worked through, the entire system of it experiencing the program, there were also pockets that still had that stability, that had weathered the storm and had kept that wildness, and especially so because the areas around it had completely changed. So because the entire system was worked through, those pockets that had remained stable have been lumped in with the entire system. It has become one unit of uniformity, if that's a word, uniformed, yeah, which again alludes to the issues of being absolute. Having one condition is not how the environment works. We always want to promote biodiversity, which essentially means all different parts and as many different species as possible as a indication of overall health. So this is a sense in which you're creating one condition for the entire river and not allowing for these different pockets and pieces of what you would call niches that help promote biodiversity.
Okay, well, I want to wrap up with one other subject, though, and that is this notion that Tropical Storm Helene, what happened in Polk County and much of western North Carolina, was not just a wind and water event. It was a geological event in that, as I mentioned earlier, the Green River has been resculpted. Huge portions of rock have been moved from where they used to be to where they are. So there's nothing we can do about that. That we're resculpting tens or hundreds of thousands of years of erosion and evolution of the landscape. So we have to be a little bit modest in our expectations of what can be done in terms of trying to restore what we had before, right?
Yeah, it's unprecedented times to an unprecedented amount of change and disturbance to our landscape. It's going to take decades and tons of scientific research to actually see and quantify those changes. There are some lower hanging fruit for restoration projects, floodplain and things along that Conserving Carolina is actively working towards helping improve. But due to the severity of it, it's not something that's going to be built in a day or two or even a year. Once again, time is the most important aspect because the severity of the disturbance, the best thing for it to heal is just time.
But we have no idea how much time we have before it happens again.
Yeah. But we can predict it. We have scientific methods to predict weather and knowing that when hurricanes are coming in and tropical storms. So we can at least prepare for. I think ultimately we're at a point where we need to accept that it is going to happen again and be prepared for when it does.
At least some of us are starting to think about what to do when this happens again. And maybe we can be a little bit more sophisticated in our response next time, right?
Yeah, I believe that's completely true. I think we can find a balance between making sure that we are all safe and there's not future destruction, but at the same time taking into consideration the natural beauty of our land and the wildness of it.
All right. Well, that's a good attempt to end on a positive note. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Again, I'd like to make it clear that I don't see much point in playing the blame game when it comes to who should have done what and when at a time when the scope of the disaster wasn't even clear. And in an attempt to be fair to those who were calling the shots, I'd like to draw your attention to the Army Corps of Engineers' official position. All their answers to Benji Jones' questions are linked in the show notes. Here's just a taste of their take on how well they respected the needs of the rivers. To minimize the impact to aquatic wildlife, contractors use high-profile vehicles to minimize contact with riverbeds and incorporate many other eco-friendly engineering solutions. For example, contractor forestry equipment uses biodegradable hydraulic fluid made from vegetable oils and synthetic esters. This breaks down within days, is 90% degraded within 60 days, and fully assimilates into the soil within 6 months. In contrast, petroleum-based hydraulic fluid can persist for over 20 years, threatening wildlife and ecosystems. And here's another answer. Overclearing is not tolerated, nor is reckless removal of debris without consideration of the ecological impact. Contractors that exceed limits receive warnings or are removed from the job. Now, how well the contractors and the Corps themselves followed this guidance is a fair question. But at least it shows that the government is not entirely ignorant of the need to tread lightly during storm cleanups. We just need to keep these issues higher on our priority lists the next time around. You can always reach me with guest suggestions and feedback by emailing jamesh@folklore.com. Thanks for listening.